I can't stop thinking about how the victim died in chapter 2 of Tetro Dangaronpa. But before we start, there will obviously be spoilers, so if you still haven't watched Tetro Danganronpa, then what are you waiting for? Watch it. Anyways, if you're still watching, then hopefully you already know who died, because rest in peace, Nishiguchi Mitsuko. When considering how this case unfolded, it honestly feels convoluted, as there may or may not have been anyone involved in the bleeding. It's possible that the motive was the paranoia of there being a bleeding, but for the sake of this theory, I'm going to say that the bleeding is real and that they are actively going against the rest of the group. First of all, let's dive into what has happened so far. And it's obvious that this chapter's theme is deception. This motive involved them deceiving the rest of the students by pretending to be innocent, and the victim is part of the mafia, which is heavily involved in deception. Aside from that, my mahjong theory remains valid, as everything that has happened so far involved cunningness and wit. The title of the investigation is Mafia Marked Man Vendetta, which refers to Yaitabashi, who's sort of implied to be the protagonist of this chapter. Originally, I had a theory where Yaitabashi could be the culprit, as it would be the ultimate deception. If he were lying, then it means Komada's alibi could actually be real. There's also this strange moment when Yaitabashi and Maekawa were investigating the girls' dormitory. Why is it that they're randomly added such a random part of Maekawa taking a break so that Yaitabashi investigate Maekawa's bathroom alone, which is also Nishiguchi's bathroom? He spent about 8 seconds investigating without Maekawa, so he could have done literally anything, could have even hidden evidence. Perhaps the reason Yaitabashi was running so fast was to tire Maekawa out, while also gaining her trust. However, I don't strongly believe this idea, as I have a better theory than this. Alright, let's start with who the bleeding are. I believe that they're the ones who actually did the murder, not a different party. But first, I have to ask you, why even bother calling it the bleeding rather than traitors? It was even directly asked in episode 154, Resistance, where Dr. Higashigaki asked this. However, Manimoko says the label was chosen by Dr. Figueredo, and so Dr. Higashigaki believes there's a deeper meaning behind this. I mean, this is literally probably something they're foreshadowing. The bleeding is probably the 3 characters who have already bled before chapter 2. I'm talking about Hirose, whose head was bleeding in the elevator, Ikeda, who was voted on many times in Voter Game, as well as Ogura, who got voted once in Voter Game and had her stomach slashed. I think that these are literally the only 3 outside of Akiba, who's already dead, that have bled already. It would make sense if they're the 3 original bleeding, but how do they actually get a new member? After sabotage, I think there's more to it than just picking a new member. Considering it involves bleeding, I bet they have to make a blood pact to ensure that they get a member, which means whoever they recruited must have at least some part of them that's literally bleeding. Alright, I'll stop beating around the bush and just say who I believe the culprit is. I believe it's Matthias. The motive is literally his motive. 2 episodes before the motive was revealed, he was literally begging to Ogura in supplication to find a way for him and Ikeda to escape. Matthias' motive was never to just escape alone, but to escape with Ikeda. And now that in the bleeding, you can escape with more than one person, it literally just feels targeted towards him. Not to mention the fact that he's gotten a lot of lore drops recently. It makes sense for him to kick the bucket soon. Because of this motive, he can't just escape with Ikeda, but also with Ogura, his goddess. This motive literally feels like a blessing for him. And so now, if Ogura was the one he begged to, it literally does feel like she gave him a blessing now that she has recruited him. Because it would make the most sense for him to be recruited. After Matthias, I bet the next person they recruited is Dendin, who was probably decided by Hirose. Now, lastly, they were probably going to choose someone who could help them, like maybe Yaitabashi, or maybe someone they're close to, like Tei, Isida, or Ninamiya. But I believe what happened was that Kumada must have heard, and so she made a deal that she'd be the next bleeding they'd recruit. Otherwise, she'd expose them. Now that I have 6 bleeding predictions, such as Kumada, Ikeda, Denden, Matthias, Hirose, and Ogura, we can start deducting how this case happened. I think they all had at least one type of contribution to the group. For Ikeda, I bet that he's the one who poisoned the food. In episode 171, Palette Gap, he was in the kitchen with Tay, so he could have been the one to poison the food. The ingredients were probably in the kitchen already, so while Tay stopped looking, he could have gone to the other ingredients to put the poisonous plant into the food. Keep in mind, what poisoned the food was herbal. But to be fair, he could have poisoned them any time. However, I think the reason Tay believes that Ikeda isn't a part of the bleeding is the fact that Ikeda barely contributed to the bleeding. Just because you're in the secret alliance doesn't mean you have to even contribute. So that's probably what Ikeda did. Then afterwards, when Ikeda said he'd be right back, he could have given Shishikara's meds to any one of the other bleeding members. But what could these meds be used for? I bet one of these meds is what was used to inject Nishiguchi in the neck to make her pass out. Now, moving on to the other bleeding members, what would even be the reason for pulling the fire alarm? I came up with 3 ideas. First, they possibly just wanted to distract the other people so that it could make the murder easier, but that's sort of unlikely. My next idea was that there might have been a fire, like possibly a very small fire to burn evidence, but we didn't see any ashes. So I bet the reason the fire alarm was pulled was a sound barrier to make it so that Nishiguchi's screaming wouldn't be heard, which means that when Nishiguchi was murdered, she was probably fighting against the killer, and it probably happened when the fire alarm was starting. However, why even bother poisoning the group if Hirose will just heal them? The reason is to secure an alibi, specifically Denden's. Take a long look at this shot. See anything odd? Now take a look at this and this. If you didn't notice, in this one, episode 180, Interruption, as well as episode 182, Corridor Bleeding, they're saying that Denden is asleep, but when there's another character that's sleeping but isn't saying anything, they normally have that small portrait at the top. But why is it that Denden doesn't? I bet that at this point, Denden is probably outside doing something, and the one who's in the med bay is just a bunch of pillows and blankets to make it look like Denden is sleeping. Because in reality, Denden was the one who probably pulled the fire alarm. However, I really doubt that she killed Nishiguchi because it would be more efficient if it were someone else. With the process of elimination, we could narrow down who killed Nishiguchi. There are 6 members of the bleeding. Ikeda couldn't have killed because he was with Yokoi and Tei in the safe house. Denden couldn't have killed because she pulled the fire alarm. Hirose and Kumada couldn't have killed because they were with Yaitabashi in the medbay when the fire alarm was pulled. So that just leaves us with Matthias and Ogura. If the culprit and the victim did fight, then we already know that Ogura can't because she's literally super tiny. However, Matthias can. I mean, he literally tackled Kumada in the storage room. However, just because Matthias was the one who tackled Nishiguchi doesn't mean he automatically killed her, right? Couldn't Ogura have put the plant in Nishiguchi's mouth? Well, no. Because Ogura has a pollen allergy. She couldn't have killed Nishiguchi, so it only leaves Matthias. It also really makes sense for Matthias to have been the culprit. Because if this chapter is about deception, then Matthias is literally all about that. He lied about his identity and deceived everyone. And now, there could be so much more to him than what he's letting on. I mean, why is it that when he tackled Kumada and told her to drop the knife, she listened? Probably because of the power he has over her. Also, I just want to point out that Kumada also couldn't have poisoned the food because she also has a pollen allergy. And so the reason she was with Nishiguchi when she was cooking the food was probably to make sure that Nishiguchi did end up using the poisonous ingredients and put the blame on her. But now I have a question. Why is it that the bleeding only killed Nishiguchi? If they killed at least one person, then they automatically win. So then why? Well, I bet that can be answered with what Kumada said in Purge the Bleeding. She asked, did they get a new member right after the sabotage, or is it the next day? I bet the member of the bleeding gets recruited after the next day. Because if you go by this line of thinking, everything lines up. During the first day, sabotage, but no one was recruited. Second day, recruited Matthias, then sabotage. Third day, recruited then sabotage. Which means that when Ishiguchi died, Komada still wasn't a part of the bleeding. That's why the bleeding only killed one. Because they still had to be sneaky and not get caught. Otherwise, Kumada would flip on them. However, now that on the fourth day Kumada has been recruited, they can literally kill anyone. But of course, they wouldn't want to do it in front of others, considering that there are strong members of the group like Maekawa, so they would still have to kill sneakily. Let's look at the investigation partners. There's Hirose and Matthias, and they wouldn't kill each other because they're both part of the bleeding. Ikeda is paired with Yokoi, but Ikeda honestly doesn't care about the bleeding, so he wouldn't kill her. Another group is Denden, Ogre, and Inamiya. And while that's 2 versus 1, I really doubt that Denden and Ogre would want to do the dirty work. So that just leaves us with the only other person who could have killed, and that's Kumada with Isuda. And the reason she asked them if they were part of the bleeding is to make sure that she wasn't killing the bleeding. But because of Hirose's crush, Kumada eventually had to retreat from killing them. Like, if we're going by this line of thinking, it literally makes sense. Here's what I think happened. Way before the motive was revealed, Ikeda stole Shishikura's meds, but now that he, Hirose, and Ogura have been selected to be in the bleeding, he has a purpose for those meds. Instead of being given paper from Monamoko, since that's incredibly risky and inefficient, Monamoko must have gone to them directly while they were alone, since we know how fast Monamoko can literally disappear and reappear. Now that the three have been selected, they just go ahead and agree to sabotage, since as said, that's the only way the sabotage could actually have been done. During the first day, the motive was revealed, they couldn't do much, but during the next day, they were able to finally recruit Matthias, and that's by Ogra making a blood pact with him. Another day under sabotage. Also during this time, Ogra was prepping by taking the duct tape from the storage room, using her event as an excuse. As for Matthias, as for what the needles could have been used, I bet it's either random syringes in the medbay, since Hirose has access to those. Or maybe he could have taken in Mia's EpiPen if he had one of those, during episode 169, Matthias. Now that they were able to prepare, they did their last sabotage. Ikeda then poisons the food in Palette Gap by putting something herbal in it. Hirose can now recruit Denden for their second sabotage, and this is the day when they are planning to attack. However, Komada must have heard Matthias talking about it, so they made a deal that she'd be the last member recruited. After episode 177, Purge the Bleeding, they all got to their designated spots to do their plans. Ogre and Matthias go together, and Nishiguchi starts cooking food. Komada watches Nishiguchi so that she makes sure that the poison gets used, but she couldn't mess with the food herself because she has a pollen allergy. Everyone gets sick, and Denden specifically gets her alibi. By having everyone get sick, it makes it so that it isn't weird that only Denden got sick. Komada takes Hidebashi away from Nishiguchi because they want to frame Hidebashi, and perhaps the reason they killed Nishiguchi was to make it seem like a non-bleeding killed her, since she was ultimately framed for poisoning the food. Maybe that was the bleeding's plan, but regardless, Hirose is able to treat everyone, and while Denden pretends to be sick, she goes off on her own to pull the fire alarm. Now, with the sounds blocking any other loud sounds like a possible fight, Komada takes Nishiguchi and brings her to Matthias and Ogura, where Nishiguchi gets ambushed. The duct tape is taped to her legs, which is what caused the bruises. And then, they ultimately inject her to make her pass out. And lastly, to kill Nishiguchi and frame Hidebashi, Matthias puts the plant in Nishiguchi's mouth to choke her, and possibly poison her, which resulted in her death. This would also make sense as to why her skin turned gray, because if she choked, then the lack of oxygen would have caused that. And if her body was discovered 6 hours after she died, then she would have definitely turned gray. Now they removed the duct tape, and if it was put on too tightly, it could have left bruises, explaining the bruises on her legs. Matthias being the killer also makes so much sense for Ninamiya's arc. I mean, he just found out that his old makeout buddy Okazaki was executed in the killing game, and now his new makeout buddy is revealed as the culprit and executed right in front of him. Alright, this was a long video. Hopefully I got to say everything I thought of, and even if the case doesn't go exactly as this, I hope that it at least has some merit. It literally makes so much sense for Matthias to be the culprit. Anyways, what do you think about this theory? If you have other ideas, then feel free to tell me in the comment section down below. I'm Maris, and if you want to watch more videos like this, then feel free to subscribe and turn on the notifications so that you don't miss the next one.